All right, everybody, we are back. It's Shannon. It's me. We're answering your questions. Shannon, you've got one for me.
I sure do. So Margaret asks, my daughter hopes to apply to highly selective schools. Her interests are mainly in the humanities and social sciences, and she has a particular interest in Japanese and in Korean. She has a rigorous curriculum that includes honors French 4 and Japanese 1 this year. She wants to stop taking French after this year, but continue with Japanese. Therefore, she would not take AP French and would have stopped her French study at the end of sophomore year. Will her world language path give admissions officers pause, or will it be considered a strong language curriculum, as she'll have one language through level 4 and another through level 3?
Okay, so the key piece here is that she plans to apply to highly selective schools.
Right.
When I hear highly selective, I think of schools with acceptance rates in the single digits. I think Ivy League, I think Stanford, I think MIT, places like that. So the question of whether or not this will be considered a strong language curriculum or whether or not the path will give admissions officers pause, my answer is that it's somewhere in between. My advice when you're applying to the most selective schools in the country is that you want to go to the highest level available in all 5 major subjects: math, science, English, history, and foreign language. I love that your daughter has specific interest in Japanese and Korean. I think you made note in the bigger question that she was not thinking of majoring in those areas, but they are a significant interest, and there will be things in the application that will highlight those interests. That's all great. I totally understand why she's added Japanese. If she truly wants to be the most competitive she would be, my advice would be to stick with the French and go to the AP level in addition to having added the Japanese. Does she have to stick with the French? No, of course not. But it is always most impressive when a student, or most expected for a student, to go to the highest level available in all 5 major subject areas. And so if we strictly look at it purely from the perspective of what's going to give you your best shot at getting in, to have gone to that highest level in French while simultaneously adding Japanese, which is not an easy language to learn, very different from something like French, which is a Romance language, that is going to be more impressive. And so what I would say is that by dropping French, she's missing an opportunity to make herself just a little bit more impressive. Is it ultimately, is she not going to get in because she drops French? Absolutely not. It never comes down to the choice of one class or another. But I think it's more, so from my perspective, it's more of a missed opportunity than that it would give anyone pause or be considered less than. It's just, she's missing an opportunity to stand out a little bit more.
And I suppose there's just the opportunity cost there. If she continues with French, there's something else she can't take. So she has to weigh those options, right?
Absolutely, potentially. I will tell you, it's not uncommon to see a student do 2 foreign languages in addition to the other 4 core: math, science, English, and history, and go to all of them in the highest level. It's not common, but it's not unique either. And that's what we mean when we talk about what you're really up against when you're applying to these schools where there are acceptance rates in the single digits. It's tough.
Yeah.
All right, Shannon, I've got one more finance question for you. And for whatever reason, my screen doesn't want to scroll. Here we go. If you have, this actually came, we did an open to the public session on Monday, actually. Stacy McFeeters and I, another member of our team, did a presentation on early strategies for basically getting more money. And this question came up and we didn't have a chance to answer it. So I said I would do it on the show. If you have multiple 529 accounts for your multiple children, do you need to report all 529 account assets on the FAFSA for your oldest child, the first one going through the process, or only the account for this child? Good question.
Excellent question. And the answer is yes, you need to report all of the 529 accounts for all of your children on your initial FAFSA for your oldest child. You're not just reporting that child's 529. The financial aid process considers 529s to be an asset of the parent, not assets of the individual children who are the beneficiary of those accounts. The process does not draw particular distinctions that you might draw in your mind, in that I've got this money in my checking account for this purpose and in my savings account for this purpose, and I've got these stocks for something else, and this is my vacation fund, and this is my college fund for one kid, and this is my college fund for another child. There's lots of great reasons to have those distinctions in your mind. For financial aid purposes, they are all assets of the parent. They are all looked at exactly the same. The only distinction between assets that are really drawn in the financial aid process, that are excluded from the financial aid process, are your equity in your primary residence and your retirement account. So they're off the table at most colleges, but every other kind of asset that a parent owns, and the parents do generally own the 529s, just because you want to use some of the money for one child and some of the other money for another child. The financial aid offices do not care about that. They know, in fact, that you can transfer money between 529s within the family. So, I've certainly heard this rumor, oh, I should put all of my 529 money in the youngest child's 529. So then I won't have to report it when the older child is applying. Not true. Doesn't work. The feds and the financial aid offices has caught on to that possibility. They know you can do that. That's why they make you report all of it. So it does all have to be reported as a parent asset. That is actually kind of a good thing, because student assets are looked at much more harshly on the financial aid application through the financial aid formula. They have a much higher assessment rate. So we don't actually want those 529s to be considered belonging to the child. They would be hit more harshly. We want to look at them as parent assets. That's how you are supposed to report them, but that also means you have to report all of them for all of your kids.
And really quickly, can you remind us how do they assess the parent asset? Because we know that
Yes.
income is the biggest, but what about
Yes.
the parent assets?
It is a very gentle assessment. It can range anywhere from 0 to 6%. So essentially, worst case scenario, if you have $10,000 in 529s for your kids, it's costing you $600 of financial aid. And that's in the very worst case scenario. It's usually not that much. So parental assets are assessed very gently. So I really, in most cases, wouldn't worry about the effect that's having on financial aid. It is minimal. It is really your income that is driving the formula. When families don't qualify for financial aid, it is almost always because of their income, not because of their savings. It's always better to save than to not save in hopes of getting more financial aid. The amount that you save helps you much, much more than the small loss of financial aid hurts you.
Right. If you were looking for how can I beat the rap strategy? I don't recommend this, but maybe you wanted 2 years before your child is going to be entering college as a freshman, you could take a very low paying job and that would at least change your income. But
sure would.
Don't think that's a great idea in general.
Right. Wouldn't help you pay for college.
No,
So,
it wouldn't.
It always hurts more than it helps. Yeah.
Exactly. And but I do like that message that saving is not a penalty. Saving is a positive. Okay.
Absolutely. Yes, so we got another question about test scores, testing very much on the mind these days.
Yes.
I listened to an episode of your podcast in which you discussed how to think about whether a student has any chance for an Ivy League caliber school. And I have 2 follow-up questions about SAT or ACT scores. 1, does above the 25th percentile mean for the composite and also for the subsection scores? How much will it hurt a student's candidacy if the composite and verbal scores are in the top 25th percentile, while the math subsection scores are not? And this is for a student with interest in the humanities.
Sure. So it's the composite score that is going to be the most impactful. When the subsection score is lower, it could be a negative if the student, or not a negative, but not a positive, I guess would be a better way to position it, because they're looking for reasons to admit. So if you are applying to STEM programs, one of the things that admissions officer is going to look a little bit more closely at is the student's performance in math and science, whether the courses they took and the grades they earned, but also the test scores they have in those areas. And if, in general, those are lower areas of testing, that could be a negative. However, if your overall, and when we talk about composite scores, we're talking about the ACT, if your overall ACT composite score is in range for an Ivy, then there's no way that subsection is all that low, because
Right.
you can't get your composite score where it needs to be if the subsection is lower. And I'm not quite sure about the 25th percentile that you're referencing. So most schools do not publish the individual subsection score averages. So I'm not entirely clear on what you're referencing there, but if you're meaning that their scores are in that top percentile, because when you get a score report, they will also tell you, hey, you scored better than 75% of the students out there. The 75th percentile is not great. Most of the schools who are looking at IVs and have the test scores that they need to be competitive are typically scoring in much higher percentiles. But here's the rub. No one's looking at the percentiles when they look at the scores. They're looking at the scores themselves. So never once in my entire career at Penn did I ever say, well, this student has a 780 on their chemistry subject test, but that's only 75th percentile. I never knew the percentile. I didn't care about the percentile. I cared about the score. So that's how that piece works.
Right.
Okay.
And the next question was, is there a score at which you advise a student to stop testing? For example, a 35 on the ACT or a 1500 on the SAT. Will a student with a 1500 ever be relegated to the no pile because of that score? And now that we've thought about this from the viewpoint of a non-hooked applicant, how much do the answers change for a legacy student?
Okay, so the answers don't change for a legacy student. Legacy students are, in my experience and in what I've seen happen since I joined College Coach, are as qualified as anybody else who's in the applicant pool. And at the schools that consider legacy, it's an extra small tip, but they need to be as strong. So no difference between a legacy and an applicant who doesn't have that legacy piece. So I would say that the bare minimum for an ACT score to be in the competitive range would be a 34. 35 is certainly better. I don't think there is an appreciable difference between a 35 and a 36. And I think there are a lot of things that students could be putting their time towards that would be a way better use of their time than getting a 35 and then going back and testing again to try and get the 36. That said, when I have a student who's super eager to do something like that, my question is always, will you feel like you have left something on the table if you go in with a 35 and you wanted to spend a Saturday taking the test one more time, then go for it. I certainly wouldn't tell a student, no, don't do that. But I also would never suggest that a student who has a 35 retest, because I don't see the point in it. There is not an appreciable difference between the two. And particularly given where we are in the world right now, I absolutely would not suggest it. I just don't think it's worth it. In terms of 1500 on the SAT, that's a tricky question, because that could mean that you got an 800 and a 700. And a 700 typically is not going to be where I would want it to be. So my advice here is that the minimum be a 750 across the board. 750 on the verbal section, 750 on the math section. For subject tests, 750 minimum and above. So that 1500 could be great because it could be a 750, 750. Or it could be less great, as I mentioned, because it could be an 800 and a 700. So really, you want those to be in general range, and I would be shooting for a minimum of a 750 in each of those.
Right. And just to emphasize again, this person asked about Ivy League schools, the most highly selective schools.
Yep.
At the vast majority of schools, a 1500 on the SATs would blow the admissions officers out of the water, right? It's just this small a subset of schools where that 700 could potentially be an issue.
Right, exactly. So 700 is generally not an issue at many schools, right?
Yes.
So those that are more selective, and again, is it an issue? Do you not get in because of a 700? No, because here is the rub. And no student would ever be put in the no pile because of a test score. In general, that 1500 is probably strong, but once you've determined that the scores are where they need to be, literally the scores become utterly irrelevant. They are not part of the conversation. I would never say in committee, oh, well, we really need to take this kid though, because he has an 800 and a 700, or we can't take this kid because he got a 700 in the verbal. The reasons that students are making it into the class is because everything else is incredibly strong. Maybe they made that choice to stick with French and added Japanese. Plus they have a distinguishing excellence, which we've talked about a lot on this show.
Yeah.
So I realize that testing is an easy thing to point to. It's so quantifiable. It doesn't change from school to school. The way they calculate the test score is not different as the way schools calculate GPAs can be different. I beg of you, I implore you to let it go. The reality is that you are not getting in because of a test score at the most selective level, and you are not going to not get in because of a test score. Because when the test scores are not great, generally speaking, the rest of the application could be great and fine, but isn't standing out anyway.
Yes.
I would say that this year, with most of those schools as test optional schools, it is sort of an interesting thing, because every once in a while you do have a student who really has excelled and just can't seem to crack the standardized testing nut. But we're not typically talking like an 800 and a 700 here, or we're really talking usually more like their testing is in the 600s. So it's really off the mark of where most of the competitive students are going to be. But even then, and so now what they get is the benefit of those scores won't be considered at all. So all the focus can be on the great stuff. But even when scores are being considered, nobody literally gets put in the no pile because of their test scores. They read every single file. I read a file whether the scores were 300s, which I did see, or they were 800s. And while it is highly unlikely that the student with the 300 level scores was getting in, it was also not a foregone conclusion that if you had 800, you were getting in. We turned away a lot of students with spectacular test scores because it's not about the test scores. So, it's tough, and I get it. Unless you've been in the room, it's really hard to kind of fully appreciate the role that the scores play, but that is the reality. Okay, well, I think that wraps it up. I think we're at the end of our time. Thank you all for being here. I'm back next week, and we are talking, what are we talking about next week? We're talking about what not to do. So admissions bloopers, early results, what these might look like and how to handle them, and then getting ready to pay your student loans back. And don't forget, we are here every week on Thursday, 4 p.m. Eastern and 1 p.m. Pacific.